All right, everyone. So a couple of years ago, Daniel and Halleck and I got on a plane. It was January of 2000, or sorry, February of 2020, to go what was called the Great Conversation. And we were invited by Ron Werman. Ron's here today. Ron, thanks for that invite. It was a new world. He described the context of these security professionals and leaders that he was gathering in Florida. I call my buddy Jeff Smiley, who's also here today, who's one of my oldest friends in the world. And I'm like, so Jeff's in cybersecurity. And so I'm like, Jeff, I'm doing this. And then he starts like, dude, this is a different space in security. They're related, but they're different. So I'm like, I go to Florida and Daniel and I arrived there, and I got to admit, I was just naive to this whole world. And it was this invitation into this. And so I walk into this session. I don't know, Brian, there were probably, and Ron, there were probably, I don't know, 150, 200 leaders in the room across this whole space. And I sit down next to Brian, and I'm like getting this education just sitting there next to Brian, who became a very quick friend of mine. And so it was just an awesome moment for us to be able to sit there and to understand his world, to be up on a panel with him that Ron gave me the privilege of being able to just talk about what does whole leader development look like. As I got up on that stage and I go, y'all, I just got off a plane and I'm kind of blown away by this reality of the people that are in the room and what this is like. So I want to read you something before I launch our panel out there. And this is at the beginning of this white paper that Wanda was this key catalyst in us getting this done together. And it says this: until security and law enforcement are done by robots, reform will always be about human beings. A reformation is different from a revolution. A reformation is a process of reforming something into a better thing based on what is already working and what we already know but may not practice. Therefore, any approach to helping law enforcement officers or leaders become better versions of themselves must be built on those fundamental realities. Security and law enforcement reform is not a revolution, but taking what we already know to be true and what's working well and paying close attention to that which must be changed. And I want to finish with this: leaders in security and law enforcement are human beings and must be treated as such. They bring all the brokenness and beauty that the rest of us carry, but with a vastly different level of responsibility for navigating human interactions. And so I just, as a start, I wanted each of them to take just a minute to introduce themselves. Wanda, would you start? Tell us a little bit about your context.
I would love to. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so I spent 21 years in law enforcement. 10 of those were as a Nebraska state trooper, and then 11 and a half were as a federal law enforcement officer. And I continue my service working in corporate security. And I'm also the founder and CEO of Leadership Unleashed, where I offer leadership training and coaching.
Awesome. Thanks, Wanda. Tim Wenzel.
I started off in the Illinois Army National Guard, ended up invading Iraq, ended up getting involved in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, but not doing the bad things. Later, I ended up doing executive protection for diplomats and working on the post-Benghazi program and training fixes. And then I've been in tech for the last 9 years. And we started the Kindness Games to spread kindness and to make people realize that they could lead with kindness and that it's actually a strong way of leading.
That's awesome, Tim. And Kindness Games has been an incredible WiLD partner throughout this last couple of years. Brian Cook.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me. Brian Cook, I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps, and then I spent 15 years as a special agent with the Diplomatic Security Service all over the world. Multiple Secretary of State protective details, tours on those, and I retired a few years back, and now I'm in the corporate security world, and I'm Director of International Security Operations for Marathon Petroleum Corporation.
Right on. Thanks, Brian. All right. So first of all, when I hear these folks talk, I'm like, I have no business talking with them. It's amazing, but I tell you that they're amazing human beings. And so I think for me, and I hope you feel the invitation, and there are so many implications for each of us, given just that experience that they have had. So y'all, I used to be a professor. Some of you know that. And so I got to give these folks an assignment, and the only assignment was to read the article that Wanda and Daniel and I wrote that was all about whole leaders in corporate security and law enforcement. And I know that you have the link to that in the chat. So the first thing is just to have this article be the muse for us, y'all. is, and Wanda, maybe you could kick us off, is like, I asked you to think about like, what is one sentence from this article that stood out to you as something that you thought was important to sort of bring up in conversation?
Yeah. So for me, number 4, which is model tactical vulnerability, is my favorite. And I just want to read a couple sentences from that section. Asking a leader in security or law enforcement to be vulnerable, either emotionally or physically, is asking them to intentionally make themselves open to being psychologically wounded. While necessary to develop a whole leader, we must always be aware of the tension between openness and safety. And so today I sit here and I think, okay, where does the tension between openness and safety come from? And yes, we could argue that, it could be the organizational culture, it could be the institution's belief system, but I want to take us a little bit deeper. And I can't help but think that that tension comes from the conflict between the ego and the soul. Because I think all of us would agree that the ego is arrogant, it's competitive, it's prideful, and I think it serves as a crust preventing us from being vulnerable. Whereas our soul is this divine light that flows within us. I think the soul is kindness, it's love, it's compassion. And I would ask Tim and Brian, isn't it our soul that actually drew us into our vocation, that vocation of protecting and serving?
Yeah, actually, I met Rob last week in person, which was crazy, right? We got to do the WiLD conversation in person. And he asked me, he's like, hey, can you just queue up next week's conversation? I said, imagine an industry where almost everybody in it was living out their childhood dream, their dream of becoming something greater than themselves, for serving a higher purpose. And some people have brilliant careers. They do exactly what they want to do. They overachieve. Some people underachieve. And so what is it like to exist in that industry where everybody is personally invested into their dreams, in their jobs, and yet not everybody is exactly where they want to be? It creates a personal nature. It combines that, when you're in physical security or law enforcement, with danger. And it creates an intensely emotional place, which is why we get the egos. What do you think, Brian?
I completely agree. And when I was working on Rob's homework assignment, I went through and I was torn. I was torn between, purpose, because that is just so profound and so important for the exact reasons both one and you just said. And that, and the one that I ultimately picked for my little homework assignment, which was number 2 item, start with yourself. Because I like to speak from my personal experience, and that I didn't become a good leader until I really took the time to work on myself. And there's a lot of different ways that looks. I like to say, and I work with veterans and Veterans Yoga Project and Lone Survivor Foundation all the time. And I always tell them, I teach my veterans with PTS, that look, we do exercise all the time, and the same in law enforcement, same in any industry. We take care of our bodies, but we don't take care of our minds, right? So we do exercise, we train, and we make sure our bodies are healthy. And everybody knows that regular exercise and good diet, and everything else is important, right? That's common knowledge in our society, in our world. But we don't, so we do the exercise, but we don't do the inner size, right? We don't do the inner size. And that takes shape in a lot of different ways, and there's lots of different ways to do inner size, and we can go down some rabbit holes on that later. But that's where it starts. It's like that's why that start with yourself was so important. Like, you're just not going to rise to your potential as a leader unless you do that inner size also with the exercise.
So Brian, when you and I met, I'd love for Tim and Wanda to kick into this. It was interesting because quite literally, I get off the plane. Daniel and I both got off the plane. And we walk in because we did a red eye, to get to Florida. And then we go up on that stage, and I'm on that panel with you. And it was interesting because I heard a couple of talks right before that where it was like all the mechanics of security were being talked about. So I am being educated like on this. Daniel and I are just going, holy cow, like there's so much for us to learn about this context. And then we're up on that panel, and then Ron Orman, in Ron's way, opens up the great conversation And it's a very different but directly related conversation, because he was like, I don't forget some of the primers that he was asking, but, and I remember Amanda being on that stage, Brian, and Gene was with us, right? And it was like, all of a sudden it was this human thing where we opened up this vulnerability. I remember each of you sharing, like, there is brokenness and beauty in my own story that's like that people don't talk about in our industry. And I think one of the things I'm so hesitant to is to sort of blame an entire like structure of an organization, like, because these are people that are responsible for protecting me. You know what I'm saying? Like, and walking that line, but like kind of seeing the worst of us. And I would say us, I mean in me, like the other person who pulls me over. And it's just all these, and I'm like in that moment. So tell us a little bit about, why is this conversation so necessary for people in your industry? Like, why is it so, you know what I mean? There's something so important in what you all were just describing. Wanda, would you kick us off, like, from your gut?
Yeah, I'm dying to jump in here. I'm going to just do some real-time vulnerability here. In 2008, I went and entered into rehab for alcohol abuse. And the reason why is because I had entered law enforcement at the young age of 23, and I saw some horrific things. I, was a child abuse investigator, sex crime investigator. And at that young age, I didn't know how to process all of that. So what did I do? I reached for the bottle. But when I left rehab, I spent 10 days. And when I left, I made a promise to myself that I would never hide my vulnerability again. And so I would ask this group to think about that. Why would you want to rob the people around you that gift of vulnerability? So once I left rehab, I just feel like I became a better leader because I was willing to show my humanness. And maybe not everybody agreed with that, but if I can just help one person, then my job has been done.
Wanda, thank you.
Yeah,
I think, go ahead, Tim.
Oh. Wanda, I completely agree with you. The interesting thing is, kind of my philosophy of leadership is that if I'm going to elevate the team, that means I need to be willing to decrease myself, right? Which, when you're in hierarchical structure in the military and law enforcement and security, there's people that may try to capitalize on you diminishing yourself to elevate the team, right? That is a vulnerability. And one of the things I continually have to ask myself is, will I show vulnerability because it's better for my team than it is for myself? And will I be able to live with the consequences?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's and Brian, will you go with that? Because I know one thing that you mentioned that something that prompted you in that article was that starting with yourself. And I think this is what were you going to say?
Yep. Well, I was going to say the way we started that great conversation in security was, and the way the origin of that is Ron Werman and I were talking, and we're looking at a room at OSAC in DC one day, and there's 300 security professionals in the room, and he was like, man, how do you guys do it? You have this inherently stressful job and you do all this stuff, and if you mess up, people could die, and here you all are, though, you're on top of it, you're watching everything happen in the world. And I looked at him, I said, no, Ron, we're not. Like, tactically we're on top of it, but anecdotally, everyone in this room here, like most people, they're on their second or third marriage, they're alcoholics, they're into substance abuse, they're super stressed out, they're not taking care of their body and their brain and their mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, as an industry, we are absolutely horrible because we all come from that military law enforcement type A, where we don't take care of ourselves. And part of it is like what Tim said, it's the purpose. Like, we go into this field to take care of other people, to protect and help other people at our own detriment, because we don't take time, take care of ourselves. And I say it all the time that we need to invest in our own personal resiliency, because organizational resiliency is built on personal resiliency. If you can have the best business continuity plans and all the widgets and platforms in the security world, in the whole world, but if your people are a hot mess, when the crisis happens, you're going to fail. You're not going to rise to the occasion, and you're not going to rise to the occasion as a leader if you're not investing in yourself, Rob. If you're not, like I said, start with yourself. That one again, I love the purpose one too, but when I was like, which one's more important? Starting with yourself, and that may even be finding your own purpose, or at least finding clarity in that purpose. And then what's going to make me better at who I am, and then that's going to make me a better leader, and that's going to make ultimately allow me to create and foster an environment in my team that allows for my team members and people on my team to become better themselves.
It's good. And when I met Brian, y'all, I am such a novice, and I'm the guy that asks the dumbest questions. So I sit down with Brian after we're on that panel, and I literally am trying to, and Jeff, don't laugh at me about this, because Jeff was the one who was educating me on like the difference between and the relationship between cybersecurity and physical. Take a shot. I can see you laughing at me right now. So it was like, so he's like educating me, and I sit down with Brian, and I go like, so what are you actually doing? By the way, Brian's life, it's a Netflix special. So like the three of these folks, like, it's like you are in a Netflix special with multiple episodes that you binge watch on a weekend. So he shows me, and he shows me this app that, you know, I remember that, Brian, you're like showing me this app where it shows every hotspot in the world and in the regions where he has responsibility for people's safety and security. And so, it's just, so I'm getting introduced to the mechanics of this work, but then also we're getting into the heart issues of this work, which has been amazing. What would you all like? Well, Tim, would you say something about what is it that resonated with you? Because you started it and Brian just referenced it, but I was curious about what resonated with you on the purpose side.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because a lot of us begin in the military or in law enforcement, and then at some point we transition to security. And it's important to reevaluate what is our purpose here. One of the most common things is to leave law enforcement, end up in security, and realize you've lost your badge. You have no actual authority to make people do anything. All of a sudden, you have to develop a personality. You have to, you know, make people want to work with you. And that is a stressful transition. You know, Rob, when you and I met, you know, I said, you know, yeah, I work in tech, right? But I came literally from being in Iraq, from working as a tactical trainer at the State Department. And as I stepped into the tech sector, into the boardroom, I was stressed because it wasn't the environment I was used to. And so what is my purpose here is a really important thing for us to be really reevaluating. But I think that's an important thing for everybody to be reevaluating as they go from context to context and environment to environment.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Tim. And man, as you know, purpose is a big deal to me because we found that purpose was the number one predictor of a person's capacity to show up well under pressure. And so it's not just a nice to have soul thing. It's also a strategic thing to actually think about why you're here. I have one question for you before we go in. And those of you that are new, the WiLD Conversation is, I always wanted to have a place to hear amazing people talk and then to be able to go talk about it for just a couple minutes. So we're going to do that to see what kind of crowdsourced wisdom we can come up with together in community. But can I ask you one final quick question? What is the thing that you are continuing to try to figure out for yourself regarding this? Like the question you haven't answered for yourself, that like the question that's important, but you may not have fully resolved. And Wanda, by the way, thank you for saying what you said, because you are not alone and you have enough friends here to know that, like, all of us are thinking about our own brokenness and our own coping mechanisms over the years. I know that. And so you just were vulnerable enough to say, like, this, let me tell you my part. And it's just one part of Wanda's story, right? If any one of us shared something like that, you'd be like, there's a whole lot of other things to understand the whole context of Wanda's life or my life. But what is the thing you're continuing to work out, each of you? And then we'll get out into groups.
I'll jump in. Brian kind of alluded to this. He said, know thyself. And I think the challenge for me is constantly, do I know myself? Do I choose myself? And do I give myself? So every day I'm reflecting, did I do those three things? Know myself, choose myself, and give myself.
Thank you, Wanda. Tim, what about you?
Yeah, you know what? I kind of touched on it earlier, that vulnerability piece, right? Will I do what's right for my team and the people around me versus what is safer for myself? And how do I deny that tension of self-preservation, that anxiety, by letting my team run their jobs, own their jobs, do their thing, and know that it's going to be okay because they're awesome. And consequences are going to come. You know, security is an odd industry. you can have a good security outcome that produces organizational consequences, because good security outcome is not necessarily a good outcome for the organization.
Dude, that's a whole other conversation. That's great. That's amazing.
Oh
Brian,
yeah,
how about you?
Tim, we got to explore that. That was great. I asked myself, how can I best share my practice, right? How can I take the things that I've done in my life to work on myself and my mental health and my wellness, and how do I share that practice with my team, with the people that I lead, both up and down the chain, and how do I do that? How do I most effectively implement that? Because the tools that work for me might not work for someone else. You know, they have different tools in their wellness toolbox. So how do I learn more tools and expose the people to these different tools and gifts that they can have to become a better person, become a better leader, become a better whatever it is that they do?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So much. I know that went fast, y'all, but please, by the way, if you don't like breakouts, neither do I. They end. That's the brilliant part. You don't have to fake your own death to get back out of them, because Claire will bring us back. So Daniel, will you get us out? Let's crowdsource some wisdom together in community. That'd be awesome.
I love it. There is so much in the chat and so much to take for whatever industry or space you are in. We're going to get into a 50.